All right, you guys can see me. Okay. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. Second lecture for the series. We have three. The first one was on the leader's character. And what we're going to talk about today is ethical decision-making and behavior in leadership. We're going to touch on a lot of things that are generally about ethical decision-making and behavior, and then we'll tag on a couple of things that have to do with leadership as well. So what I'd like us to do is I'll start at the end. We'll talk about a couple of case studies I'd like you to be thinking about while I go through the analysis, and then we'll come back to them. So I'll read through these pretty quickly, and then we'll go back to the other material. So first case study, you are the chair of the tenure and promotion committee at your university. Your committee is composed of senior faculty, and it evaluates the teaching, scholarship, and service of professors, and then makes recommendations to the university provost. Committee members take their responsibilities seriously, knowing that peer review plays a critical role in higher education. They feel obligated to maintain high teaching and research standards. No professor can be tenured or promoted to a higher rank without a positive recommendation from this committee. Those denied tenure must leave the school at the end of the school year. Your closest departmental colleague is being reviewed for tenure. Your families sometimes celebrate holidays together, and your children are friends. He expects that you will offer a positive review and encourage the committee to recommend tenure. Unfortunately, your coworkers' teaching evaluations are below average. His scholarship is not strong enough to make up for these shortcomings. You know that your colleague will be devastated by a negative evaluation and will be forced to move to another city to take a new job. He will feel betrayed and will blame you for the committee's decision, though you are only one voice in the group. And the question is at the end, will you support your colleague's application for tenure?
What's his name?
So that's one case, just some details with a moral problem to handle or deal with. Second case, you're the municipal judge deciding less serious cases involving violations of traffic laws, disorderly conduct, fish and game regulations, and local ordinances. A case involving an undocumented landscape worker charged with reckless driving is on your court docket. You know that U.S. Immigration and Custom Enforcement, ICE, officials will be waiting outside the courtroom to take this individual into custody following the hearing. He has lived in the country for 20 years, is married to an American citizen, has 3 children. He will be deported even though his crime is a minor one. Relations between your local court system and ICE are tense. Federal officials have stepped up their efforts to deport undocumented immigrants. At the same time, your town has declared itself a sanctuary city, which limits its cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. You and the other judges are committed to keeping the courtroom a safe place for all citizens. You and your colleagues worry that members of the immigrant communities will refuse to report rape, domestic violence, and other crimes if they know they will be taken into custody when they come to your court to testify. You could let your reckless driving defendant escape ICE officers by having him exit through the door used by court officials. Doing so would be seen as interfering with federal law enforcement and might bring obstruction of justice charges in an investigation by the local bar association. Nevertheless, you believe that you would have the support of the chief municipal judge and your fellow jurists if you let the defendant walk out the side door. Would you let the defendant use the side door? So we'll go back to the beginning. And so probably 2 cases, one having to do with whether you would offer somebody a recommendation that doesn't deserve it. The second one, what do you do with this defendant who's in this precarious position, minor crime? Do you let them slide through the bag and avoid being deported? So you probably have some ideas of what you would do or general direction. So I want you to kind of have those 2 cases kind of percolating in your mind, and then we'll come back to them. Okay. So the first part I'm going to address is really quickly, what's an ethical decision, right? It's a process where you determine the most morally acceptable course of action, right? Ethical decisions address ethical problems or dilemmas. A couple of examples. Should I write a letter of recommendation for my friend who doesn't deserve it? Should I lie to protect our team from getting into trouble? Our company is about to merge with another company. This means potential layoffs. When do I announce that the merger is happening? One of our employees has been having trouble at home and is rude to others at work. How am I going to handle this? So you're going to make some decision about what to do there. And that would be some examples of ethical decisions. The next part, we'll talk about, well, what am I doing when I'm making an ethical decision, right? So for a long time, we thought that ethical decision making is just primarily a cognitive process, right? I think about the facts, I make some calculations, and then I determine cognitively by thinking about it consciously what the right thing is to do. And that's been a prevalent kind of model for a long time. It's prevalent in everyday life when people talk about making moral decisions. We often think that it's just me. I assess the facts, I'm being objective, and I decide. But as far back as, as early as the philosopher David Hume, who had said that reason is actually the slave of the passions, right? We have these emotional reactions and so on, and then our reason kind of backs those up. More modern versions, empirically based approaches like moral psychology, cognitive neuroethics, cognitive neuroscience, and neuroethics provide evidence that intuition is often the determiner of an ethical decision. And then what happens, then I use my reason to back up what I already determined through intuition. And intuition happens without us noticing it very much or at all. So intuition often comes first. And you'll see why it's good to know this in a minute, why it's good to know about this. So moral intuition, according to Jonathan Haidt, a moral psychologist, he says it's an evaluative feeling like, dislike, or good or bad, right? You're evaluating something about a person or event without any conscious awareness of having gone through steps, weighing evidence, crafting arguments, or inferring a conclusion. So it kind of happens really quickly, almost automatically, right? How does he know this is happening? He has this concept called moral dumbfounding, right? So he asked his students, or one of the examples he gives is, he asked his students, do you think it's morally wrong to eat the family dog? Right? You come to my house and I tell you, I remember my dog Zeus, we're having him for dinner. And then my wife shows up with a tray and the dog's on the tray. Would you think that would be morally bad? Yes. But then he asks them, his point isn't to figure out if it's right or wrong. It's to figure out what we're doing when we're trying to decide once the question's posed, right? So what he finds out is that people have this quick reaction to say, oh no, that's disgusting. It's our family dog, right? You don't eat the dog. And then he asks why, but then they're kind of fumbling to find a reason for why. So that tells us that the intuitive reaction comes first and then the search for reasoning comes second, right? As opposed to the other way around, at least in those examples, right? So it's pretty clear that often this is exactly what we do, right? We react through intuition, make a determination, and then we think that's the right call, right? And then we use reason as a lawyer as opposed to as an investigator, right? Our reasoning, our logic, employing that, it's backing up what we already decided is the right thing, as opposed to figuring it out objectively. So Haidt gives this metaphor of the elephant and the rider. Some of you heard me talk about this before, right? The elephant is the part of ourselves that's more intuitive, the automatic processes we employ without necessarily being conscious of. And then the rider is your conscious mind using logic, weighing evidence, and so on. And he says the evidence in psychology is, in general, is that the elephant is much more powerful than the rider. I might want to make a certain decision in a certain direction and consciously be pushing in that direction. But if the elephant decided, some automatic processes already determine you're going this way, that's where you're going. Now, The rider, he says, can direct the elephant sometimes, but it takes a much more effort, training, awareness, and so on than we might suppose, right? So my instantaneous intuitions about right and wrong are the product of social forces, such as my cultural background, right? The fact that I react so quickly to eating the dog, right? Where's that coming from, right? We learn how the pets, you love your pet and so on. And then when you say, well, somebody's going to eat, in your case, Max, you're like, oh my God, you're not going to eat my dog? Well, we're not eating my dog. It's like a kid, right? So that's, social forces, cultural background drives that. Now, how about reason? Well, he thinks reason is still part of the picture, right? Other people may challenge my intuitions, right? If I haven't, whether I'm going to help the guy escape through the back or not. I mean, that may be intuitive, and somebody gives me some evidence, especially if I'm listening a little bit, to change my intuition or to challenge my gut reaction, say, right? They may present new information, compelling arguments, and then I may change my position after reflection, right? Sometimes your intuitive response to something is X, but then 2 days later, you're like, oh, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have thought like that, right? You have time to process and maybe a little more consciously. So the point I guess I'm trying to make is we need to use both. We use both reason and intuition, so we have to pay attention to both, right? Recognizing the role of intuition in decision making allow me to direct it in a better way, as opposed to thinking every time it's just me thinking objectively, and all that's involved is logic, right? And then its intuition is happening in the background, but I don't have no idea it's going on, right? It's better if we know what's going on. We can pay attention to it. Sometimes we need to regulate our initial reactions, or at least later on reflect back and say, well, is that the right thing to do when intuition isn't at play at the moment, right? And recognize my social situation and my cultural background may have influence on my sort of gut reactions to moral situations. One example we could give is somebody may accept corruption in their organization because the organization has weakened intuitions about right and wrong. The way people react to the fact that corruption is going, nobody else around them says it's bad. It's the cost of doing business or something. And then I learn the same behavior and I have the same reaction, but then I accept it not because it's a conscious choice, but because the environment around me kind of pushes that. So what should we do? So it's a matter of some practice. I chose this picture because I can't imagine myself getting into a pose like that without extensive practice and so on. So maybe we should step back and reappraise the situation and my reaction to it, right? I can then begin to train my intuitions a little bit, like I might work on developing parts of my character. It takes some practice, some work, some conscious effort. Here's a practical tactic, we could recommend that's going to incorporate both reason and intuition. So say there is a moral situation, one thing you can do to kind of slow yourself down, record your initial reaction to an ethical dilemma first. How did you react? What was your response? Then use a decision-making format. Well, I'll show you a couple, at least one of those at the end. And other cognitive tools to test your initial response. So now decision-making format is going to ask you certain kinds of questions, ask you to go through certain kind of steps to make a better decision, consider more factors, reflect a little more, and so on. And then when done using the decision-making format, compare your final decision to your initial reaction. What are they saying? Is there some discrepancy? If so, why? Right? And then you can begin to make some little discoveries that you could use in the future. So what's the benefit of the tactic? There are a couple, right? Now, I had an intuitive response, but then I also slowed down and thought about it, right? The solution I came up with, or my decision, I may be a little more comfortable with it. Why? It's informed by my experience, by my emotions, by intuitions, as well as conscious reasoning using a relatively objective tool, right? And then it also allows me to slow down the process, things consciously. Conscious processing takes longer, more effort than automatic responses would. So in terms of what's involved in ethical decision making. You have two components, an intuitive one and then a rational one. But then the other thing to talk about is once I come to perform a moral action, right? I made a decision to help somebody. Now I'm helping them. What happens before I get there, right? So James Rest has a model of moral behavior, and his colleagues came up with a way to explain how do you get from what's going on up here or in here into acting morally, right? So they kind of work backwards, and they claim the moral action is the result of 4 steps. The first step, they say, is moral sensitivity. I recognize that there is an issue in front of me that's morally important and that requires a response from me, right? Is there any issue here that's ethical and that requires a response from me? I need to be morally sensitive in some way. The second step, after I recognize it's an ethical issue that requires a response, is judgment. What's the ethical issue exactly, and what's the right thing to do? Okay, I've gotten there. Then, am I motivated to act or not? Like, where's my moral motivation? Am I going to be able to move on and do what I decided or not? And then along with moral focus or motivation, you have moral character, right? Some parts of yourself that are going to be geared up for you to act. So we're going to talk about moral sensitivity and moral judgment only today, because the other two might take a little more time. But the first two, one's going to be more about intuition, the other one about both reason and intuition. We'll start with moral sensitivity. So it's the first step towards moral action. Examples of failure, right? Moral failure due to people being morally insensitive. That might help explain a little bit. So the case of the Ford Pinto, I don't know how many of you know about this or remember about it. So Ford had this car, the Ford Pinto, that had these explosive tanks. If there was an accident, somebody hit you from behind, there were reports that there was evidence that the car would catch on fire, right? Ford found out about it, and they have a safety committee that considers these kinds of concerns. And their choice was not to withdraw the car and to choose to pay the damages, right, after the accidents would happen. Now, why is this morally insensitive? Well, because they're thinking in terms of saving money, what the cost in price would be versus human life. A morally sensitive person would say, well, this is killing people. Maybe that's what needs to be driving our decision, right? So, and then this got out and went to courts and so on. Toshiba, the Japanese company, had a couple of problems. One of them is their executives were overstating earnings because the focus was showing high quarterly earnings and doing the right thing in the company, right? Treating people correctly and so on. I'll give you an example with students. I catch students sometimes cheating on an exam or plagiarizing. How do they get there? Well, if my concentration is of finishing my degree, right? That's I'm thinking of just finishing my degree. Maybe cheating becomes morally acceptable because it's just a means for me to finish my degree, finish the class and get the degree, as opposed to thinking, well, this is a moral situation that requires, moral language, moral thinking, the right thing to do, and so on, right? So what would it take to recognize I have an ethical issue or problem in front of me to be morally sensitive? Maybe we slow down and start asking questions, and that could be our first move, right? How does my behavior affect others, right? Is it going to hurt them in some way? Is it going to benefit them in some way? What are possible courses of action? What are the consequences of each course? If I do this, what will happen and to whom, right? Empathy and perspective skills, right? These help with us being morally sensitive. This is one of the reasons I suggest, one of the things I suggest to people, read literature, right? It shifts your perspective from you to some character who has a moral dilemma, and then you're thinking, well, what would I do, right? And so on. So moral sensitivity is crucial for action, and then it's something we could cultivate to work so that our intuitive response to situations becomes one of moral sensitivity, where I could kind of more automatically notice when I have ethical dilemmas or ethical problems. What is it that prevents me from being morally sensitive? Well, there are a number of things. A number of possibilities. One is framing, the way I think about or interpret or I talk about as an ethical issue. Sometimes I might frame an ethical issue as a business issue or a legal one, right? So it's okay to take bribes because this is how people do business. I could think like that. So I'm framing bribes instead of right and wrong. In terms of right and wrong, I'm framing it in terms of, it's what people do to do business. You take bribes. It's okay to market strawberry milk with a lot of additives and added sugar to children because it's not illegal, right? So I frame the issue as a legal one, but notice when I do that, I avoid thinking about the situation morally, and then I'm off the hook. As long as legal, I'm doing it, right? But a lot of times the law doesn't cover things it should and so on. Maybe we're still on the hook morally, right? Another one is reluctance to use moral terms, right? Use terms like fair, right, wrong, and so on to describe what I do. I might use other language. And then the third one is ethical fading. I deceive myself when I'm acting ethically when I'm not. I know I do this sometimes. The moral aspects of a situation kind of, they start there and then you fade them into the background. How do I do that? I use euphemisms, right? I could use other language, describe my behavior in different ways that aren't going to capture moral language. I numb my conscience by doing the bad thing over and over again, and then it becomes normal. Or I just blame the other person. I just say, well, it's their fault. If they didn't act like that, I wouldn't have to do the thing I'm doing. So what I'm doing is good. How to enhance moral sensitivity? How are you going to become more morally sensitive if you're not, or if you are to become more? So, take ethics courses and ethics training. How does that help? Well, you're exposing what's involved in ethical decision. You're dealing with ethical decisions all the time. And then some of them and the principles you use to think about things will more easily translate into you looking at other situations outside that training or that course that you'd be able to recognize, oh, it's like the thing we did in class. We're talking about this, or there's a value involved here and so on. Reflect on ethical issues often. Active listening and role-playing could help, right? In some ethics classes I teach, we do role-playing, but active listening helps. Then I hear the other person's perspective. I'm sensitive to whether they're hurting or not, right? As opposed to just waiting for myself to talk. Read literature, to me that's obvious. Avoid euphemisms. So when there are bombings, we say, well, there's collateral damage. That to me always sounds like, bricks, like collateral damage. It doesn't sound like people are dying, right? George Orwell had a couple of terms, that he pointed out, like pacification, right? When communist armies or police would go into these towns in Russia and say, well, we're going to go pacify them. What does that mean? It sounds like you're doing something nice to them, but they're really lifting them out of their homes and sending them to prison and so on. Population transfer. What does that mean? Well, you're going to the gulag, right? That doesn't sound like, that we don't have a moral thing going on. Don't excuse me for misbehavior. Talk about it, accept responsibility, and be open to other points of view. A couple of things we could kind of slow down and do. The second one is the second part of moral action. And here we're going to have some intuition, but also a lot of reasoning. Select a course of action. I judge what's right and wrong to do. That has two parts. So moral judgment, it could fall on different stages. So moral development, right? So when I'm a kid, when I'm younger, most of us, our moral development is of a certain kind, right? We think of right and wrong in a certain way, and then we judge based on that, right? Based on cues from parents, from schooling, and so on. As we grow a little older, other things, we become aware of other aspects that may come to it, like what society's thinking, maybe, right? What the law says. So I may be driven to moral judgment in different ways. And the second one is biases. Sometimes our judgments are the result of some moral error, right? Or mental error that undermines decision making, at least a good one. Cognitive moral development, there are a number of models. One, a lot of times people talk about this in psychology, like Kohlberg has this model where you go from pre-conventional morality when you're thinking about yourself, right? Before you enter like a conventional environment where other people agree to some things to do, right? The thought is, I'm going to do this because if I don't, I'm going to get punished, right? My moral judgment is on that, or I'm going to get rewarded, right? The conventional level, Kohlberg describes it as kind of in a linear way, as if when you start when you're young, you're more selfish, and when you're older, you're thinking about principles, which isn't quite accurate. But the conventional level is, I'm thinking about what people around me expect, right? What's my social environment? Maybe my family, school, society in general, and so on. Post-conventional, now become more of an independent thinker. I apply principles to think about right and wrong, justice, fairness, and so on. I think about those and I apply them more objectively. The rest was a student of Kohlberg's, and he thought that the model is kind of too rigid. It's not like we go from one to the other kind of in a linear way, but they kind of mix together. In some aspect, I'm not going to do something because I'm going to get punished, but over here I might think of principles. So it's much more of a mixed model, a mixed approach. And then him and his colleagues created this test where they ask subjects to react to certain moral problems, and then they rate the language they use to explain their decisions, right? How are they thinking about it? Are they thinking about it in terms of rewards and punishments, in terms of principles, and so on? And then they rate the responses. And then some of the results from the study are that contextual variables and ethical environments play an important role. So if I'm in an environment that emphasizes doing the right thing, gives me tools by which to do it, chances are I'm going to be higher on the scale. I'm going to be more post-conventional and be thinking more fairly. Education helps and fosters moral reason. Not a degree, but if you're educated in certain directions, humanities, liberal arts people tend to do very well on those. Having a broader perspective is better, right? You understand other people's needs, interests, that sort of thing, and then using models like the one I'm going to show you yield superior solutions because you're covering all the angles and you're giving yourself something objective. Ethical blind spots, right? So, or biases. So a lot of times unethical choices aren't done consciously. The person is mean or evil consciously. They just do it because there's something else going on. And this is a lot of times intuitive. The first bias would be overestimating how ethical that can be. There's multiple pieces of evidence here. Think about the Milgram experiment, right? People think, I would never shock somebody with electricity because somebody told me, right? And then the experiment shows most of us would do it. All sorts of examples there. There's one example, Bazerman asked his female students, if an interviewer asks you an inappropriate question during an interview, would you say something? And 80% of them said yes, but then when they were put in situation, they never said it. But the appropriate question wasn't too bad. It was something like, do you have a boyfriend, right? Instead of saying, well, why are you asking me this? It's irrelevant. They answered the question, right? So they overestimated how ethical they would be in those kinds of environments. A lot of times I forgive my own unethical behavior. Cognitive dissonance is a interesting phenomenon for human beings, right? When my want self, what I want and what I should do clash, right? I want ice cream, but I shouldn't eat it. Then I eat the ice cream, and then I tell myself, well, I'll be fine. It was okay, just an ice cream. But then I eat a second one, and I might say something else to myself. So I resolve that conflict either by changing my behavior, I'm not going to eat it, or excusing the behavior by changing my belief, right, and making my behavior okay. So we do that too. In-group favoritism happens sometimes. Notice in sports, for example, we often say, our team plays hard, but the other team cheats, right? It's, we have this tendency to favor people in groups. And in leadership, there's a theory called leader-member exchange theory that suggests that in organizations, members of in-groups, right, treat each other one way, and then those versus out-groups in other ways. Not always unfairly, but there is some discrepancy sometimes. Implicit prejudice when I make associations that aren't necessarily true, right? I see somebody with a fancy car, and I associate that with wealth. Maybe they just, I don't know, they borrowed up to their eyeballs to get it, right? A lot of people do that. Or when you think physical disability, right, you think lower intelligence. They don't go together, right? Or you think woman, right, passive, right? Some people make those associations. That's implicit prejudice or bias. And then the last one, judging by outcomes, not the process, right? Some people ask me, well, how else would you judge? Right. Well, sometimes the process is bad and the outcome is good. And then you think that because this outcome came out of this process, next time when I apply the process, you're going to get a good outcome, but not necessarily, right? So outcomes sometimes and processes need to be thought of together. So the last thing we could say about biases is that I might intend to be the best person in the world, but it's not enough, right? My intention to be good isn't enough. And we notice this from people a lot of times who do something and said, well, that was out of character. I'm not that person. I would never do that. But we fumble sometimes because it's not just a matter of intending to be good. It takes more. Here's my decision-making model. Well, it's not mine. It's Richard Kites from Viterbo University, ethics professor there. 4 stages, right? And then the thing I like about this model is it incorporates various moral theories. It's going to have some limitations, like all of them would, but at least it gets us on the way of thinking about a case, slowing down, and then being able to kind of measure our intuitions a little bit if they come up, and also to give us tools to think about a case more comprehensively. So the first stage, right, called truth, or the thinking modes, right? So emphasis on understanding the facts and the context. So I'm asking some questions here. What are the facts? What's going on? It's like in the case I gave you with writing the tenure letter, right? Who's involved? Well, me, I'm the chair of the committee. And then who else is involved? My friend. What's likely to, who else is involved? The committee. What do they like? Like, what's their approach? All those kinds of details. What are the facts? What are the relevant laws, if there are any? Like, I need to know, not necessarily to follow them, but to know what the expectations are legally and so on. That could be a question. What's the policy of the organization? Are there organizational policies I should be aware of? And what are the pertinent professional standards if you have some? It could be other things we gather in terms of what's going on. The second set of questions or thinking more is consequences. What's going to happen after you take a course of action, right? So what's going to happen after I don't write a letter of recommendation for my friend? He's going to have to move and get a job somewhere else. Our friendship is over, right? My kids might be upset, right? Because his kids that are friends are going to leave, right? So I'm going to cause some, grief to my kids. Might be minimal, but it's still something maybe I should consider. So who are the stakeholders? Who's involved, right? Notice your kids are the stakeholders, but maybe less so the college students who are going to be taking classes from this guy who is incompetent and so on. How are they going to be affected? Which solution will be most beneficial or least harmful to those affected, right? Could talk about that. The third mode would be fairness, right? Now we're taking the perspective of the other party a little bit more, and we try to get equality if we can, and we can understand equality in a couple of ways. Try to treat others with respect, and come up with a fair way to resolve the dilemma. What are the questions we could ask? So one thing we could say, do the possible solutions treat others the same way you want to be treated? do the proposed solutions treat everyone involved with dignity and respect, right? Am I respecting the other person or the people involved? Lots of cases where that doesn't happen. Are the proposed solutions motivated by goodwill, right? Or are they just what the people's position is all the time, right? And the last one's character. Now, fairness, paying attention to, justice theory, that sort of thing, and character a little bit more about on the virtue ethics approach. So this one pays attention to the whole person. Can the proposed solutions be enacted virtuously, compassionately, wisely, with courage, and so on? Will carrying out the proposed actions make the agents more or less virtuous? Is it going to jeopardize my character to do this or that, right? Is it going to jeopardize somebody else's character? Are we building trusting relationships? So it's this approach. Maybe more questions we could ask, but the point I'm trying to make is that it gives you things to think about more on a 360 kind of approach to decide morally, as opposed to going with your gut, right? Sometimes going with your gut's going to work, but sometimes it's not. And how would I know? Maybe come up with some decision-making model. There are others we could use to come up with more objective ways to think. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think of these case studies? So first one is, I write letters of recommendation for colleagues, for students all the time, right? Or I'm asked to. Sometimes you have to make a decision. Decisions aren't, especially if you don't want to write one, or if you're going to write one that isn't flattering or what the person wants. It's not an easy decision. What would you do, and why?
What's his name?
Putting you on the spot.
I think this is obviously relevant for professors in the room and myself as well. But certainly, it's you have to think of in my opinion, like the reverse, right? A supportive recommendation when in fact you don't feel that that's the right thing, and what the consequence of that down the road for students or other colleagues as well. And I think that we have to look at it from the perspective of is our role in our jobs, right? So there comes those, I guess, different hats that you wear in life, where sometimes you're a mom or a dad, and sometimes you're a professor, sometimes you're an administrator, and that might, afford you a different response in those different roles in certain situations. But when it comes to what your job is, you have to follow ethically what your job is, because that's literally what you're hired and paid to do, number one. But that's from the logistical perspective, I guess. But then from the philosophical and ethical perspective, if you're giving someone a review that is not truthful, then there are implications beyond just the letter that's sent to somebody that reads it.
Yeah, I think you're touching on a number of points. One is, the consequences part, right? What are the consequences, and who's going to bear those consequences, right? So, for one consideration needs to be, like you suggested, right? That if we promote somebody who's not a good teacher, who is not a scholar, doesn't do what's expected to be at that level, right? Then we're harming students, right? We're putting somebody in the classroom who doesn't need to be in the classroom. We can do better, right? And so on. So that's one consideration. The other one is somebody another one we can mention is when I start writing letters just for anybody, right? All the time, right? I'm writing letters for people who deserve it, who don't deserve it. I just write a nice letter for everybody, right? That might lead to that ethical fading trap, right? Where I'm not thinking about myself, whether I'm doing the right thing or not, right? And people's interests and needs and so on and consequences. I'm just, I don't want to be on the hook for whether it's a moral decision to write a letter or not, right? So I'm just going to write one for everybody and be nice, right? And then the moral question just kind of fades in the background because I've written 5, 6, 7, 8. By the 9th one, I'm not thinking about morality at all. Or even by the 2nd one, I might not be.
What does it have to do with ethics, though?
So again, you could walk through the model and just see some things that are going to come up and see whether it helps. Jim?
Just a couple of thoughts about this case. So starting with, say, a letter for a student. Students often think that they're doing something that see this letter for a student getting graduate school or something. They don't see that we don't see ourselves as doing something for them. We see them as kind of fulfilling our professional responsibilities and doing our best to help them succeed.
Yeah.
But if I write a letter praising some student who is not going to succeed in that program, then I'm hurting all the future students who might have succeeded in that.
Yes.
program. So I'm not going to write a wrong letter for a weak student.
Yeah.
At law school, because the next good student is going to suffer.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of larger contextual thing. How well that translates to the writing a letter of support for the faculty. It might translate, right, that he starts taking my letters less seriously or something like that. But another kind of aspect of this case is when we're thinking about how strong our letter should be or what our personal / professional opinion of this person's performance in the classroom. I think sometimes it's important to kind of look at the standards around us.
Yeah.
So that, if I think, oh, this person's just a terrible teacher or something like that because they don't do X, Y, and Z, but then, as a matter of fact, most of the professors don't do X, Y, and Z on this campus, then I need to kind of recalibrate and take more care of what I'm going to say.
Right.
Right. So that won't really directly address what we should do in this case, but things to start thinking about as we're deciding.
Yeah. The other thing that's missing from the case is, what's been the process of getting feedback for this person, right? So we're assuming the person got feedback normally 2-year, 4-year evaluation, and they were given some feedback and they didn't respond to it appropriately and so on. So now when it's time for you to write the letter, you can't. If it's on the 2-year review, maybe you say, I'm going to write you a mediocre letter, but when you get your next review, here are 5 things you need to do, and make sure you do them, right? Give them a warning or a cushion, but in this case, you're at the end of the process, right? And by the way, this isn't exactly how we do things here. It's kind of close, but not exactly. I'm borrowing this case from a textbook. Anything else on this case? And notice what Dr. Spence is bringing up is this idea of the wider context, right? That could be part of the facts, or who's going to be affected, right? You want to branch out, especially writing a letter of recommendation for students, right? If I write a letter of recommendation for everybody, right? And then people who receive the letters go, oh, it's this guy again. He wrote another great letter for this person who was terrible, right? And then I'm hurting the student who needs the good letter, right? My recommendation. Yeah. Deserves a good letter, yeah. How about the judge case? This is actually inspired by a real case in Massachusetts. The judge who chose to help the undocumented immigrant through the back door is facing charges. It was 2018 or 19 this happened in Massachusetts. He's facing federal charges for obstructing justice. She knew it was going to happen, but she did it anyway. I think the case is still being litigated. Did she do the right thing? She's in a lot of trouble. Lost her position, not getting paid. Right? She lost her position. She's no longer a judge. or is she suspended until they figure out what the sentence is gonna be? Did she do the right thing?
One, it's hard, from back here, it's hard to read all the details of the case.
It's okay.
So we talk about the details of the case. But one of the interesting possibilities about a case like this is even if you think the right thing to do is to send it's still possible that maybe the person doing so did something wrong, not because that act in itself was wrong, but maybe like you said, because they're letting their family down because they lost their job and now their kids helping them. So there's that kind of larger context.
Right. So a lot of times, like you may do the right thing here, right, in this context, but then you're putting at risk 5-6 other people who might depend on you, right? And that's always a pressure of, ethical decision making. Some people willing to take the risk, but somebody who isn't, it's hard for us to say, no, you should take the risk, and your children now may lose their home or something like that. If you're putting them at risk for doing the right thing over here, you have to think about, well, the right thing over here creates this big moral problem over here. So the thinking like contextually is very, very important. But sometimes our reaction to these cases is like you're suggesting or like trying to get us to avoid is it's kind of narrow, right? Especially if it's an intuitive gut response, right? And then our thinking is kind of all over the place, or it's not going in the right direction. What else? Anything else? What do you guys think? You're a pharmacology student, I could tell.
I mean, personally, I think I guess not to relate it to a lot of personal experience and stuff, but morally, for me as a person, I always would do best for someone else than for myself. That's just personally who I am, and I feel like I would help that person because they've lived a life of 20 years in this country, and they haven't done anything wrong. And this charge could have been when they were a teenager. We don't know. They could have moved on, and they just found this one opportunity. And I just feel like it's really sometimes incriminating that ICE waits for those opportunities when they find some old case to just deport someone right then and there when they've already lived their whole life, 20 years here. They might have a reason why they couldn't get a green card, because I know sometimes that's not the easiest accessibility to get that too. So there's a lot of other reasonings behind it, but the thought of that did for me is that ICE doesn't really take those thoughts into mind. They just be like, oh, this person's illegal immigrant, we have to deport them because that's our job.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem the judge had, right, is that they're not going to take into consideration these other factors. The infraction is minor, right? And then they noticed the part of her calculation was the effect it was going to have on reporting other crime, right? Because one of her concerns was that if, say, you're the victim of rape, right, or your sister is, and you saw it happen, then you're asked to go to court, what's going to happen to you to testify? You're going to be deported, right, potentially. So she thought that chilling effect was going to be problematic, so she was motivated to help the guy go through the back door, but then she got caught, and then she's facing charges. Yeah.
I would have thought it similarly to her, but from my perspective, on your original, it's not up by the way, more of the case study.
Yeah.
It didn't mention the wider context, so it's pointed out the last one where questions for her own family.
Yeah.
But for myself in that very moment, not only would I probably have thought about the other person, but I would have thought, in not realizing it even consciously, but intuitively, that it's going to hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
Turn that person over, and in my guilt, know that I've just destroyed their family and doing so.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Right. That you would be violating some sort of principle or thing about you, that you wouldn't be able to make that's the fourth part of the model, right? That you wouldn't be able to be virtuous. You lose your your character in order to act. But the moral sensitivity part is recognizing that if I do something, something happens. If I don't do something, something happens as well. So that spotlight is really shining bright in my face, right? So either thing I do is going to have repercussions, and they're probably going to be bad for somebody, right? So she chose to, I don't know how much risk her family is in terms of financially and so on. Probably, my guess is not too much, right? But at great risk to herself, like she chose to do that, right? Maybe similar thing. She couldn't live with herself, right? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that both of these scenarios are right. Like, I'm gut instinct, like, you want to help the person right in front of you, but then we try to think about the bigger context, right? And so if she loses her mom license, and maybe she could have gone on to fight the system, but she didn't because she lost her mom license. Right?
Yeah.
So there's bigger pieces, and then I also think that, like, there's some privilege associated with it too, right? So if you're in a position where you can afford to do your job, it means you can make that choice, but if you can't afford to lose your position, then you can't. And so, like, as a society, maybe those people that are in positions of privilege are more bound to act in a way that helps people that are less privileged than them. Right? So maybe you need to, like as a bigger context, like, if you sit in a position where you can help, you should, but you shouldn't put it on people who, like, have the most to lose to make that choice, and you can't really see the whole scenario.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly relevant. I think, we could end with Spider-Man, right? Spider-Man says with great power comes great responsibility, but part of the point, and I think it's, it's from a comic book or whatever, but I think it's true, right? That if you're in a position of higher power, you're able to do more good, the moral burden on you is probably should be more, right? Than somebody who's, the risk they're going to take is tremendous, right? If you could do the right thing with less risk, there should be more pressure for you to do it. Yeah, I think that's right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I enjoyed hanging out with you, and maybe we'll see you at the next one.